Well, good evening, morning, afternoon to everybody on this webinar, wherever you are. I know we have people joining us from all over the world. Certainly, I know that we have people joining us from a number of countries in Africa, Kenya, Rwanda, Ghana, from Latin America, Costa Rica, from Canada and the US, from Scandinavia, Singapore, from all corners of the globe. People are listening to this, this webinar. So I want to welcome everybody to this event. And thank you very much indeed for joining us. So the first thing I want to do is just hand over to Adrian Trett at LI, the British group of Liberal International, and who's going to make a few introductory comments. Adrian, over to you.
Thank you, Myles, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our event on the UN from the Liberal International British Group. My name is Adrian Trett, and I'm the chair of the group. Liberal International British Group is an associated organisation of the Liberal Democrats, and it is something that we value very much, including international forums to discuss topics and issues which are relevant to today. And the UN's future is a crucial topic to talk about tonight. And I look forward to hearing the views of our expert panelists. So please do sign up to Liberal International British Group via the website. I'm sure there will be a slide or two at the end of the presentation of the evening, which will give you more details. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our three key speakers for this evening. Firstly, Professor Allan Rock, who was Canada's ambassador to the UN from 2004 to 2006. And before that, he served in the Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien's cabinet, first as Justice Minister and then as Health Minister for 10 years. After the UN, he became the Vice Chancellor of Ottawa University, and he's now a law professor there, specialising in international humanitarian law. Secondly, I'd like to welcome Aicha Elbasri. I hope I've said that correctly. Is a published author, journalist, and was the UN spokesperson in Darfur in Sudan during the conflict between 2000 and 2013. Elbasri occupied several communication positions at the UN, and she became the second person to blow the whistle on the UN's cover-up in Darfur after Mukesh Kapila, which earned her the 2015 Wiedenhauer Prize for truth-telling. And our third panelist this evening is Hillel Neuer, international lawyer, diplomat, writer, and activist. Hillel is the executive director of the UN Watch, a human rights NGO in Geneva, in Switzerland. In 2018, the McGill University awarded Neuer with an honorary doctorate for his work to advance human rights and for being a voice for those without one. In 2016, the city of Chicago declared Hillel Neuer Day, citing his role as one of the world's foremost human rights advocates and his contributions to promote peace, justice, and human rights around the world. The Tribune de Genève described Neuer as a human rights activist who is feared and dreaded by the world's worst dictatorships. And finally, it's my absolute pleasure to hand over to our chair for this evening's debate, Professor Myles Wickstead, who's a former British ambassador and UK representative on the board of the World Bank, and now inter alia visiting professor of international relations at King's College London, and chairs the Lib Dems in International Development Group. So over to you, Myles, and look forward to hearing from you all this evening.
Thank you so much, Adrian. That's great. So so we're basically going to do this evening in two halves. For the first 40 minutes or so, I'm going to ask our speakers to make a presentation for around 12 minutes each. And then I'm very keen that we spend enough time on questions and answers. So there is a Q&A function, as you will see on your screens. Please put any questions you have, either general, for all the panelists, or specifically related to any of the presentations. And please feel free to make comments as well in that box, and we will pick them up. I have a couple of people behind the scenes who'll help me to make sure that we pick up all the key questions that are being asked. So without further ado, I'm going to turn first to Allan, and then to Aicha, and then to Hillel. So Allan, it's a great pleasure to have you on, and we look forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Myles, and thank you for putting this program on today. I thank Liberal International British Group, and it's a delight to appear with my colleagues on the panel. It's not hard to find things to criticize about the United Nations today. I think it's self-evident. It's a bloated bureaucracy. It's frequently incompetent, sometimes corrupt, very often ineffective. And perhaps most unforgivably, it was unable or unwilling to respond to mass atrocity in Myanmar, a genocide, as a fact-finding group has concluded, and in Syria, where a government turned on its own population for its own purposes. But against that, I think in fairness, we should also mention the United Nations has had enormous successes in the period since 1945. There's been no major international armed conflict. That had happened twice in the 30 years before its creation. The UN has successfully used convening power to bring the world together to collectively address issues like development through the Sustainable Development Goals, which have been galvanizing, and to bring us to one place in terms of climate change with the Paris Accord some years ago. In addition to that, of course, the United Nations peacekeeping presence throughout the world has saved lives, has quelled armed conflict in many places. And let's also remember, in fairness, the United Nations is an institution, an inanimate institution. It has no will of its own. It only acts as and when its member states permits. So really, we often find ourselves criticizing the UN when we should be leveling our criticism at member states. And it's all too easy for them to avoid their own responsibility by pointing their fingers at the institution. You know, Dag Hammarskjöld once famously observed, the initials SG stand for Secretary General. They also stand for scapegoat. And perhaps the first step we should take if we want a better and more effective United Nations is to try to develop a better class of member states. I suggest when we're talking about the United Nations, there are really two UNs. There's the humanitarian UN and there's the political UN. On the humanitarian side, I speak about those departments and funds and agencies that foster development, that feed the hungry, that respond to natural disasters, that support and resettle refugees, that advocate for vulnerable children, and of course, that keep the peace. And indeed, just last week, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the World Food Programme for its exceptional contributions to humanity. The humanitarian side has its flaws. Those in blue helmets betray their trust inexcusably when they sexually exploit the most vulnerable who are in their charge. And there are other flaws, but by and large, the humanitarian side of the United Nations does noble work and does it well. It's on the political side that you find the focus of most criticism, the follies of First Avenue, with the Security Council, supposed to be the most powerful organ of the United Nations, with a structure that's outdated, unrepresentative, undermining its legitimacy, but also with vetoes for the 5 permanent members that paralyze the council, make it frequently incapable of performing its important role. The most solemn responsibility of the Security Council is to maintain or restore international peace and security. And the charter, the UN Charter, gives the Council extraordinary powers to achieve that purpose. But too often, the Council fails in that work because of the paralyzing veto. You know, when it comes to threats to international peace and security, one of the most important is the prospect of mass atrocity, the genocide, the crimes against humanity, when a government turns on its own people and either murders them or stands by while others do so. And this indeed causes not only widespread deaths, but also forced displacement, resulting in refugees, which destabilize the region and sometimes far beyond. Look at Syria as an example, and the destabilizing effect of the sudden arrival of a mass number of refugees from Syria. And Myanmar resulted in almost 1 million refugees in Bangladesh. And the Security Council in all of that, missing in action. The veto prevented it from taking any meaningful step. And this, notwithstanding the adoption in the General Assembly by member states of a decision 15 years ago, unanimously, that we collectively would respond through the Security Council in a timely and decisive way to prevent and to stop that very kind of mass atrocity. We vowed to take that action. So, if mass atrocity is a prime threat to international peace and security, if the Security Council is responsible for maintaining that peace and security, but will not or cannot, what do we do, speaking of reform of the United Nations? Well, we could talk about withdrawing the veto or adopting some restraint in its use, but believe me, that's been tried. I tried it myself, and it's not going to happen. Nothing in this world is more difficult than to persuade those who have power to voluntarily relinquish it for the benefit of the collective good. It's not going to happen. And so what we need is a plan B. And indeed, the member states of the United Nations have already started developing that plan B. And what do I mean by that? We mentioned 4 ways in which we can respond collectively to mass atrocity, even if the Council stands in our way. First of all, the General Assembly and other organs of the UN have begun adopting effective accountability mechanisms, whether it's the international, independent, and impartial investigative capacity looking into war crimes in Syria, whether it's the Human Rights Council doing the same through fact-finding and eminent persons group in Yemen and in Venezuela and elsewhere. These accountability mechanisms can come up with reports, can preserve evidence, can make the case, which we may not be able to present now, but perhaps someday we'll be able to put before the International Criminal Court. Second, some states, the Gambia, for example, Netherlands, have gone to the International Court of Justice, seeking declarations of state responsibility for contraventions, for example, of the Genocide Convention. The Gambia against Myanmar in connection with the Rohingya, Netherlands against Syria for contraventions of the Torture Convention. These are effective ways of giving the victims their day in court and adjudicating on responsibility. Third, and this is an innovation, as a result of the work of a brilliant scholar at New York University's Law School, Dr. Jennifer Trahan, a book has now been written and published with respect to the legal limits on the veto in the hands of the P5. She makes the argument very compellingly that indeed the P5 is as bound as anyone else by the Genocide Convention, and by standing in the way of effective action to prevent or stop mass atrocity, they are in contravention of their legal obligations under that convention. For those and other reasons, Dr. Trahan makes the case that we should start attacking the legality of the veto, and by taking that case for an advisory opinion to the International Court of Justice, we can do so. And my last point is that member states must begin to consider alternative sources of authority when, as in the case of Rwanda in April 1994, or Srebrenica in 1995, mass atrocity is in prospect or in progress and something must be done. There are alternative sources of authority. Scholars like Paul Williams, like Harold Coe, have made the case that member states going to the General Assembly or regional organizations seeking authority in that rarest and most exceptional kind of a case where lives hang in the balance and action must be taken and the council won't respond, there are alternative ways to seek and obtain authority. So I suggest all of these are, in effect, reforms of what we're doing now, welcome innovations that will allow us to overcome obstacles created by the unwieldy and outdated structures of the UN, and allow us to save lives and achieve the noble mission set out in the Charter. with that, I draw to an end, and I look forward to your questions and discussion with my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allan. That was that gave us a great overview. Thank you very much. And you've set out some of the challenges and the absence of political will for reform, and some of the levers that it might be possible to pull in order to bring that reform about. I'm not going to ask any questions and direct them at you specifically at the moment, but I would remind everyone participating in this webinar that the Q&A function is live. We are getting comments and questions in there already. That's great. Keep them coming. And whilst we do that, I'm going to hand over to Aicha to ask her to make her initial comments. Aicha, over to you.
Thank you all for having made this possible. I would like to thank the Liberal International British Group for being liberal enough to give me the opportunity to express my opinion on the reform of the United Nations, or the lack of it. In fact, I am in favor of building a new organization instead of reforming this one. I'm in favor of democratic, multilateral organization that when it says we the people, it really means it and acts upon it. I have participated in several debates on the UN reform, and I noticed that when the UN believers are overwhelmed with the scope of the harm caused by the UN, they tend to say, well, the UN is better than nothing. But having worked in the UN and for the UN for more than 10 years, I reached this conclusion, this sad conclusion. Nothing is actually better than the UN. And please don't get me wrong, I'm not conservative and I'm not a Trump fan. I'm an ultra-democrat actually, who believes that the best cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy, as the American author Edward Abbey rightly said. The UN was built around the interests of the big five, which are the US, the UK, France, China, and Russia. And when people see the UN failures or talk about the UN failures, I only see the outright success of a system that was meant to impose the will of great powers on the rest of the world. A system that couldn't care less about the most of the nations outside the small club of the big five. So let's take a quick look at how and why the UN was created. This will explain the wars and the mayhem the world is experiencing right now. So as you know, the organization owes its existence to the American presidents Franklin Roosevelt, who in 1943, in the middle of the World War II, came up with the concept of the United Nations based on an idea of the four policemen, the four major allies of that war, which are the US, the UK, the Soviet Union, and China. Roosevelt, his idea of the UN consisted of three branches: the executive and the enforcement branch, made up of the big four, who should be acting as the four sheriffs, and an international assembly representing the members of different nations of the UN. So according to this concept, the four policemen would be responsible for keeping order within their spheres of influence. And since we're talking about a historic period of time when the world was ruled by imperial powers, the spheres of influence meant a partitioned world according to the colonial order at that time. And to prevent new wars, Roosevelt proposed also that countries other than the four policemen had to be disarmed. This included France, which he never considers as a victor nation, but rather as a power that collaborated with the Nazi, and such it had to be disarmed and treated like the Germans. This is how Roosevelt looked at France. This was the original concept of the UN, which was discussed between 1943 and 1945 and adopted after several revisions. As a compromise, the idea of disarming the rest of the world was dropped. Another major compromise allowed the big four nations to become five, and five nations that hold a permanent seat and a veto power. France was imposed by Winston Churchill as the fifth member of the council. He maintained that it was important for his country to rebuild France so that the UK could have a strong country in Europe between England and Russia. So this historic background helps us actually to see the root causes of the problems we are facing today. And the problems that will always be there because they are rooted in the design of the UN. And I would like to talk about these three deficits: the democracy deficit, the human rights deficit, and the security one. And I will highlight them briefly one by one. First, the democracy deficit. Let me start by saying that the promotion of democracy cannot take place under the UN umbrella. Unfortunately, we badly need this democracy. The word democracy appears nowhere in the UN Charter, and the permanent seats and the veto power makes the Council itself undemocratic. In addition, none of the big five is a democracy, or rather is a full democracy, sorry. Since two of the Security Council members, China and Russia, are characterized as authoritarian regimes. And according to the Democracy Index, the US and the UK aren't full democracy, whereas France is considered as a flawed democracy. In other words, it's delusional to think that democracy has a chance to spread across the world with such democratic deficits at the level of the UN leadership. So when the UN is preaching democracy at the national level, the big five refuse democracy at the international level, where the global decisions are taken mainly by the Security Council, the G7 or G8, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization. They're taken without the participation of smaller nations, let alone the civil society. And after 30 years of debate on the UN reforms, none of the big five is willing to give up the veto power and fix this undemocratic order. And as a result, our right to a democratic and balanced world will be buried as long as the UN is around. Second second deficit is the human rights one. The UN Charter claims to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of the human person, and in equal rights of man and women and of nations. Let me say that these are empty words. This is sheer propaganda that was inserted into the Charter to make sure that the UN is appealing to the rest of the world. Talking about equality between the nations, when the UN by design puts five nations above the rest of the world, is actually cynical. As for human rights, the UN couldn't care less since day one about these basic rights, starting with the right to life. And that's why a human rights abuser like Joseph Stalin is one of the UN's founding fathers. And Russia's official records show that the number of executions were about 800,000 of the human beings who were executed until under Stalin. But researchers believe that this number could go all the way up to 9 million. So please imagine this mass murderer signing a charter that speculates about human rights. So the UN has been cynical since the beginning. The other example of the charter's disrespect for human rights is the membership of France. Had the UN truly cared about human rights, it would have never accepted France in the driver's seat, or in a seat actually. France, a nation that had actively collaborated with the Nazi invaders from 1940 until 1944. And it had helped the Nazi deport 76,000 Jews to death camps in Germany and Poland. Had France been held to account, instead of being rewarded a permanent seat with a veto power, maybe the Rwandan genocide would have never taken place. The mass murder and genocide, unfortunately, were accepted and are at the core of the UN. So that's why the UN has repeatedly and systematically refused to prevent genocide and mass atrocities despite disposing of the tools to do so. As you know, 70 years ago, the then 55 members of the UN adopted the General Assembly in Paris, the Convention on the Prevention and the Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. However, when the Big Five were clearly alerted, briefed, and warned, they never activated the genocide prevention, be it in Rwanda, in Sri Lanka, in Srebrenica, in Darfur, in Myanmar, and now in the Xinjiang province of China. This prompted Jörg Schwanzenberger to say, the Genocide Convention is unnecessary when applicable and inapplicable when necessary. No, the UN didn't fail to prevent genocide. It never actually tried to succeed in the first place. In Rwanda, for instance, both Paris and Washington blocked the UN action when they knew a genocide was taking place. They even weakened the definition of genocide under international law so they could avoid acting on it. Why? Because as Human Rights Watch report put it, the Americans were interested in saving money and the French were interested in saving their ally, the genocidal government. This is the consequence of having a Security Council whose objective has never been to prevent genocide and mass atrocities. As a result, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and other atrocities have become ordinary crimes. The UN even added ethnic cleansing, a term that is yet to have a meaning under international law. So if we want to keep the UN around, we should accept mass atrocities and we should stop lecturing the rest of the world about human rights and security. The third deficit and the last one, the security debacle. The opening words of the UN Charter say, "We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to humankind." This statement makes us believe that the UN is a creation of the people from different nations across the world. In reality, as we just saw it, or at least addressed it, based on its architecture and 7 years of practice, the Charter should read, "We, the Big Five, determined to impose our will on the rest of the world at the expense of the lives and the well-being of the people." Why? Well, because the UN was founded by colonial powers based on the common understanding that the powerful nations will rule the world based on the so-called spheres of influence. Following the decline and the fall of 19th and 20th century style empires and the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the spheres of influence became spheres of interest, governed by economic and other interests. The word has certainly changed, but each of the big 5 nations still has exclusive spheres. And that's why the Council never discusses crises that a P5 member considers to be within its own exclusive sphere of interest. And this was the case of Chechnya, Tibet, Xinjiang today, Northern Ireland yesterday, or Colombia. It took 20 years to discuss Africa's longest war in Sudan, and it took 10 years to put the ravaging war of Uganda on the UN Security Council agenda. These are some of the forgotten conflicts that the Council ignored according to the mutual understanding of exclusive interests, spheres of interest, which literally means or involve oil, gas, gold, access to uranium, arms sale, markets, and other interests. So instead of saving the future generations from ravaging wars, the Big Five have been waging wars of aggression on sovereign nations, violating peace and security. And as you know, not long ago, the illegal invasion of Iraq by the US and UK on March 2003 showed how 2 leading members of the UN make mockery of the international law. The UN also authorized the use of force for humanitarian regime change in Libya and turned the UN into a tool of death and destruction. The ongoing war in Syria tells another story, a horror story. So when clash of interests at the Security Council turns into indirect wars through proxy players, we've seen one of the worst disasters that's still ongoing. And in Libya, the Big Five inaugurates another level of immoral order. Following his resignation, the UN envoy in Libya, Ghassan Salameh, revealed that most of the Security Council members, permanent members, gave the retired Lieutenant General, Haftar, the green light to militarily attack the very Tripoli-based government they had installed and claimed to support. So when an international and an intergovernmental organization reaches such levels of hypocrisy and immorality, it simply needs to be resisted, dismantled, and instead of reform, it should be dismantled and build a new one. Many people would disagree with this stand, my stand. They still think and want to keep the UN around for this reason. And you must have heard the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, say that the biggest accomplishment of the UN is the most important powers didn't fight against each other, and that nuclear war was avoided. No, Mr. Guterres, that's not true. The fact that the Cold War never developed into a hot one cannot be attributed to the UN, but to the fact that both sides are armed with nuclear weapons, and they know that any direct confrontation would mean self-destruction. The big powers aren't suicidal. They will not wage direct wars on each other because there's a balance of terror, and that has nothing to do with the UN. But Guterres...
Aicha, I think probably we need to conclude on that note, if that's okay, because otherwise we're going to run out of time and people have got lots of questions for you to follow up on your wonderful presentation. So if you've got 1 or 2 more things you want to say, and then I'm going to hand over to Hillel, if I may.
Sure. So, well, I just mentioned the 3 major deficits, the democracy deficit, the human rights deficit, the security deficit. And based on these 3 elements, at least, it's important to say that the UN will not change. As Mr. Allan Rock just said, the P5 will never give up the veto power, this order will remain, and that means that we have to accept the word as it is, a word that where the small nations bear the burden of the huge suffering, continuous wars, and chaos. This is unacceptable. When I hear people say that the UN has succeeded because no major war between the big powers has occurred, I feel that they say it's okay, that small nations are destroyed, that genocide is happening, and that's this word is being raked every day, and that's something unacceptable to me. What I have in mind, not to reform the UN, because the foundation is shaky. The foundation is not there. There will be no improvements. There will be a sustained order that is absolutely harmful to most of not only the small nations, but to the world. And this is something that we're going through right now.
Thank you so much. That's great and very heartfelt. And there are a number of questions which have come in from participants about, how you democratize the UN. Do we need to start again from scratch? But we'll come on to those in a minute. Hillel, I'm going to hand straight over to you, if I may, please.
Thank you, Myles. It's a privilege for me to be participating with Liberal International, which has been a steadfast partner with UN Watch and 23 other NGOs that co-host together the annual Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy, giving a voice to the voiceless and supporting human rights defenders from all four corners of the globe. In 12 days, we're going to celebrate UN Day, which will mark the 75th anniversary of the United Nations Charter going into force in October 1945. And the United Nations Charter is one of the great documents of liberal internationalism, and something that I think is an important thing, particularly in this framework, to underscore the internationalism that we want to see as not a blind, generic internationalism. It's a liberal internationalism, just like we don't want regular, plain democracy. We want liberal democracy. And in the United Nations Charter, the charter was created, as it says in the preamble, to, quote, reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. And in the short time that I have, I want to take a look at how the United Nations has upheld that promise, that pledge, to reaffirm the faith in fundamental human rights for peoples of the United Nations, and to ask what kind of a reform, if any, we should be seeking at this time, 75 years later. And let me begin by a brief recap of the history of human rights at the United Nations, in particular, the Commission on Human Rights, which was founded 1 year after the United Nations. It was Eleanor Roosevelt who was the founding chair. René Cassin, the great French legal philosopher, was the vice chair. And my teacher from McGill University, John Humphrey, was the secretary and played a leading role together with representatives from Lebanon, China, and other countries. And together, within 2 years, they managed to adopt this incredible document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, on December 10th, 1948, which to this day remains a beacon of freedom for those suffering oppression and injustice around the world. And the Commission itself, over time, began to be a body of members. And ironically, paradoxically, absurdly, too many of the nations that began to join this body tended to be countries whose primary expertise in human rights lay not in upholding human rights and respecting human rights and reflecting on how to protect human rights, but on the contrary, on how to abuse human rights. And I want to refer to Kofi Annan, who in February 2005 delivered his report, In Larger Freedom, where he said, and this is 2 years after the regime of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi was elected as chair of the Commission on Human Rights, after Sudan, which had been accused of genocide, was a member, China, where more than 1 billion people denied any form of basic freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, and so forth. These were regular members, and Kofi Annan said that the Commission on Human Rights had become rife with selectivity and politicization. He said it was casting a shadow upon the reputation of the United Nations as a whole, He said members were joining not to uphold human rights, but rather to shield their own records of abuse, to criticize others, and to protect their allies. He called for a new body, a new and improved Human Rights Council. And those of us here in Geneva who were part of that process, there was this tremendous debate that took place for 1 year. And in March 2006, just about a year later, the United Nations did something that is rather extraordinary. It scrapped one of its famous bodies, the Commission on Human Rights, that had existed for 6 decades, and it called for the creation of a new body, the Human Rights Council. Instead of 53 members, it had 47 members. And one of the primary things that Kofi Annan had referred to was put into the provisions of the council, namely the requirement that all members of the new and improved Human Rights Council were obliged, and I quote, to uphold the highest standards of human rights protection and promotion. That when voting on country candidates to the Human Rights Council, countries, those voting, and the elections will take place tomorrow for the next batch of 15 countries that are about to be elected, that countries would consider the candidate's record on human rights. Finally, I will never forget Jan Eliasson, who flew here to Geneva, then president of the General Assembly, pulled out the UN Charter from his jacket pocket and said that in upholding the UN Charter, we have a new provision, Article 8, which says that those who commit gross and systematic violations of human rights can be suspended from the Council. It was very clear when Louise Arbour, the High Commissioner of Human Rights, said this would be the dawn of a new era. One of the pledges was that the membership would change, that it would uphold certain criteria. Fast forward 14 years later, and sadly, the membership today includes countries that are widely considered to have not just poor records, but to have gross and systematic abuses where human rights violations are not blots on the system, which every single country has, including the country that I grew up in, Canada, the country that I live in today, Switzerland. All of them have blots on the system. But the question is whether it upholds UN criteria to elect countries where the blot is the system. And when we speak of countries like Libya, Eritrea, Venezuela under the Maduro regime, Philippines today, Mauritania, which has slavery, Cameroon, the killings are going on, Qatar, treatment of migrant workers as slaves. These are countries that by any measure fail to uphold the promise of 2006, the creation of the Human Rights Council. Those are the members today. And sadly, those who read the Guardian newspaper, which reported on the press conference that we had hosting dissidents from China, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Russia just on Friday, will know that tomorrow, China, Cuba, Pakistan, Russia, and Saudi Arabia are most likely, in some cases 100% likely, because there's no competition, to be elected to the Human Rights Council. So sadly, these are the members. And it is said that because of these members, that it's not surprising that there's never been any resolution, any form of accountability whatsoever, even attempted on China, 1.3 billion people, never been one resolution for those victims, on Tibetans having their temples crushed, on human rights lawyers being arrested, on more than 1 million Uyghur Muslims being herded into so-called re-education camps. We don't know what's happened to many of these people. The extinguishing of liberty and freedom and democracy in Hong Kong, none of this has ever made it to the Human Rights Council floor in the form of a resolution. There's never been a commission of inquiry. There's never been a special session. The same goes for women's rights in Saudi Arabia, nothing. Same goes for Turkey, Zimbabwe, Cuba, Russia in terms of its domestic situation, and the list goes on. Yes, the Council has taken action, importantly, on Syria. Finally, after 10 years of our proposing draft resolutions on Venezuela, finally this year, they took action and created a mechanism of accountability on Venezuela. And there's been action on North Korea and Belarus, but regrettably, too many get a free pass. Now, for tomorrow's elections, it is said that by diplomats quite often, and journalists just repeated it to me today in an interview, saying, well, why should we complain that Xi Jinping's regime and Vladimir Putin's regime and Prince MBS of Saudi Arabia, that their regimes are being elected? After all, we need universality. The UN believes in universality. And I believe it's a straw man argument And they say, well, you know, what do we want only Norway to be elected? And I say that's a straw man argument, because no one that I'm familiar with, I don't know anyone who said that only Scandinavian countries should be elected to the Human Rights Council. On the contrary, the Human Rights Council is obliged to elect countries from every region, but we're not obliged to elect the Cuban police state that has been a dictatorship for 6 decades, when you have a country like Costa Rica right next to them that has a very respectable human rights record. And if you go into every region, Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, you will find many countries that may not be perfect, but have either very respectable records, or at least they are not among the world's worst abusers of human rights. We are not obliged to elect the world's worst abusers of human rights. And in the resolution, those diplomats who say that it's universality, and that's why they're not going to, and I need to state for the record that to date, here in Switzerland, the leaders of Switzerland have not said a word about the candidacies that have been presented with lies in their pledges by China, Russia, Cuba, Saudi Arabia. No European Union official that I'm aware of, or any European Union foreign minister or leader, has said a word about the candidacy of China, even if they've spoken out on the human rights situation there. No one has said a word about their candidacies, and they will say that, well, it's universality, they all need to be there. That line of argument, it flies in the face of what the United Nations resolution says. It speaks of criteria. It speaks of members upholding the highest standards. Jan Eliasson flew here to Geneva and said, we have Article 8, which speaks of suspending those who commit gross abuses, which happened only once in 2011 when we campaigned to remove Gaddafi, and finally during that war in 2011, it happened. So those who say universality are ignoring that is, of course, a principle of the UN, but the membership criteria were put in the resolution. It's not me, it's not Amnesty, it's not Human Rights Watch, it's in the UN resolution. Those who ignore it are ignoring UN resolutions. Now, finally, I just want to make one final point about this issue, is that we are told by some foreign ministers that we need to have certain countries like the regimes that I mentioned, because we need a big tent, and these countries will, by joining, will learn about human rights. And this is what Margot Wallström, former foreign minister of Sweden, said. They will learn and improve. And I spoke at the United Nations, and I said, at the Human Rights Council, I said, well, perhaps nations with spotty records, but who actually do wish to make progress, can be embraced and given technical cooperation, for example, to train their judges or police. But does the United Nations have to keep electing the world's worst abusers, dictatorships whose only intent is to win a false badge of international legitimacy? And it happened in Canada when the Saudi ambassador was asked by a Canadian magazine called Embassy, why should Canada sell military equipment to Saudi Arabia when they commit human rights abuses, abuses of humanitarian law with that equipment? His answer was, quote, don't you know, we've been elected to the UN Human Rights Council. It's a false badge of international legitimacy. And so I asked all of those who propagate the so-called Big Tent theory, since Vladimir Putin's Russia was first elected to the council more than a decade ago, elected again and again to the council, did he learn and improve, or on the contrary, did Russia assassinate more journalists, persecute more dissidents, and launch more deadly military invasions than ever before? Since China was elected repeatedly to the Human Rights Council, did the communist regime learn and improve, or did they crush more dissidents like Liu Xiaobo than ever before? And I want to know, since Venezuela was elected and re-elected to the Human Rights Council, did the Chavez and Maduro regimes learn and improve, or did they arrest, persecute, and jail more opposition leaders like Leopoldo Lopez and Mayor Antonio Ledesma of Caracas than ever before? So let us be honest about what we're saying. And we know that when Belgium was admitted, Prime Minister Charles Michel 3-4 years ago admitted before his parliament that Belgium voted for Saudi Arabia to be on the Women's Rights Commission, known as the CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women. We know that Belgium, the cable, it was leaked to the Belgian media, the cable that went from Brussels to New York was vote for Saudi Arabia and make sure you tell the Saudis that we voted for them. Now, not surprisingly, moments later, Saudi Arabia voted for Belgium to be on the Security Council. So they can say it's for universality, learn and improve, but let's be honest, there's a lot of interests and vote deals happening there that have nothing to do with what the UN reform was of the Human Rights Council. To conclude, there is so much that can be done without needing to reform structures if countries only live up to the mandates that are in front of them. That means reforming their own practices. Our democracies, and I'm speaking as someone who grew up in a democracy, who lives in one, we have the power to introduce a resolution for the Uyghurs. We could introduce a resolution for Alex Navalny, who was just poisoned because he has the courage to speak out. We can introduce a resolution for Rosa Maria Paya, whose father, Oswaldo Paya, was the Nelson Mandela of Cuba and was apparently assassinated by the regime. They refused to allow a UN investigation of that incident. We can introduce resolutions. We can require special sessions. Urgent sessions only need 16 signatures. All of these things are possible. They don't require a single bit of institutional reform. It's only political will. So I believe that the Human Rights Council does not have the power of the purse, does not have the power of the sword, but it does have the power to shine a spotlight on the world's most urgent situations. It can shame abusers. This, it turns out, is a very powerful weapon. The worst regimes are afraid of it. I think we need to live up to the promise. We need to work with the institutions. If we do so, we shall truly reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights.
Thank you so much, Hillel. That was great. And thank you all three presenters for some heartfelt and very powerful presentations. Much appreciated. I'm going to ask a few questions now. There's been a lot of activity on the Q&A box. I'm going to ask a general one, or at least two, for all of you. And then there are one or two which are for individual panelists. So first of all, I'm going to, and I think in view of the shortage of time, I'm just going to have to ask these rather than hand them over to people to ask them themselves, I think. But I want to ask two related questions. The first one is from Perry Kamak, who asks, what do the panelists think of using UNGA Resolution 377 of 1950, United for Peace, to force action when the Security Council is unable or unwilling to act? And then a slightly related one from Eric Cohen. And the question is, why or why not do you believe that UNGA would reflect better judgment than the UN Security Council? And what lessons and concerns should we draw from the performance of UNHRC about giving more power to UNGA? So can we take them in the order in which you gave your presentation? So Allan, perhaps I can turn to you first, and then Aicha, and then Hillel.
When I referred in my presentation to the prospect of countries, member states, looking beyond the Security Council for authority to take action to stop mass atrocity, I was thinking specifically about the Uniting for Peace resolution and a decision of the General Assembly. And the cynical question, why would the General Assembly be any better at its performance than the Security Council? I simply say, the General Assembly is at least the parliament for the globe. Every member state is there. Every member state has a voice and a vote. It's not like the P5 and the Security Council where you have the big powers hoarding authority in their national interests. You have a more diverse group, and I think a better prospect of getting a fair outcome when you're seeking that kind of authority. As to the Human Rights Council, I was in the room when we drafted the provisions in the outcome document in 2005. The idea indeed was to escape the horrors of the old Human Rights Commission and start afresh with a body that would look critically at those presenting themselves for election and enforce those standards by throwing people off if they abused human rights. We've fallen far short of that. Some good things have come from the council, like universal peer review, but we've fallen far short of that. And I guess I come back to the point with which I started it when this webinar started. The United Nations is imperfect, but you mostly have to look at the fault of the member states, not the structure itself. And I agree so much with Hillel that people just complied with their obligations and took advantage of the opportunities presented by process to raise issues and get them decided. We'd be better off. My last point is, in terms of the General Assembly, I would also point out that when Russia tried to block funding for the International Independent Mechanism on Syria in January of this year, they were defeated in the General Assembly. They failed in their effort to block funding for that. The opinion of the world was, no, this must proceed. There must be accountability. It's reason for optimism about the General Assembly. Thanks, Myles.
Thanks very much. Aicha, over to you.
Thank you. Well, the reason why I still believe that the raison d'etre, the reason why the UN came to existence is actually security, or at least as we believe and as we demand, is security, is protecting the nations around the world, human beings, sovereignty, and 75 years from the history of the UN has just shown us that this is not happening. This has not happened even with the UN peacekeeping. Actually, some of the Big Five have turned the peacekeeping into a tool of waging wars for their interest. And France, again, has used and abused this in its former colonial colonies. So the point is, the General Assembly may act on some issues, but when it comes to security issues, it hasn't been able to do so for so long. Its decisions, and the UN Security Council knows that, of course, everyone knows that, these decisions are not mandatory. And that's why the Security Council members have been abused their seats, and I have no illusions under that. I've seen unfortunately, the ugly face of the UN when it comes to peace and security in Iraq. I saw the destruction. I worked there for 2.5 years, and I saw how the UN is still collaborating with dictatorship regimes and empowering governments that is actually fighting its own people. The same in Sudan. I was witness to the UN cover-up, which I exposed, cover-up of genocide. I lost faith in the UN. And I don't count on me to talk about the reform, to talk about any hope for a better UN. The design, the structure, the performance, the cynical order that we entered with in the case of Syria, of Libya, and the Middle East, and the way it actually helped destroy the Middle East, left no hope, in my view, for a better UN.
Thanks very much, Aicha. And Hillel, over to you.
Thank you. You know, there's an interesting discussion emerging on institutions and whether we ought to trust the Security Council or criticize the existence of the veto of the Security Council versus the General Assembly, which has the appearance of being more democratic. And the truth is that both have serious flaws. We've seen that important humanitarian action has been blocked repeatedly by the Russian veto, Syrian veto. At the same time, sometimes a veto can block measures that are problematic. We've seen in the General Assembly the same thing. Sometimes the General Assembly can take action to do something good and adopt a resolution, as we expect this year, on human rights in Iran, on human rights in North Korea, in Myanmar, and so forth. And yet we see that the General Assembly will tomorrow elect China, Russia, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan to its Human Rights Council. And I could give many more examples that everyone on this call knows of both good and bad things that the General Assembly can do. And as people have said, it's the member states that do these things. The question is whether we can call, granting more powers to the General Assembly to be more democratic. It has the appearance of being more democratic, but those who sit on the General Assembly and not the Security Council include MBS from Saudi Arabia, a regime that's been accused of inviting a journalist into their consulate and chopping him up into little pieces. Erdogan, who fired 130,000 people, has thrown more journalists in jail than maybe any other leader in the world. Duterte, who kills thousands of people in the name of a drug war. Kim Jong-un of North Korea, I don't have to specify there. Mugabe, who recently died, who destroyed Zimbabwe. And we go on and on. Lukashenko of Belarus, they're all in the General Assembly. what I mention these countries is that many of them, not all, but many of them are unelected. And so it has the appearance of democracy, and we call it a parliament, but the parliament I voted for in Canada is a free and fair election. Many of the regimes, not all, but many of the regimes at the General Assembly do not represent the Saudi people, do not represent the Chinese people. So it may have the appearance of representing the peoples of the world, but it doesn't. So we have to be careful about two things. One is if we really consider the representatives who are there of regimes as representing their people, and even if they did, do we want to allow naked majoritarianism without tempered by liberal democracy, by liberal internationalism, and just to allow majority rule of the General Assembly can be a dangerous thing, depending on even if the governments are elected, people can 9 people can vote to throw the 10th into the water. So it's a dangerous thing. We don't have the constitutional human rights protections that exist in a country at the United Nations. So I think you're going to have pitfalls with any institution that you use. At the end of the day, what we need is our democracies, those countries who are supposed to care about human rights, our societies, to do the right thing, to lead, to work in concert. That, more than any institutional issue, will do the right thing for victims who need our help most.
Thank you so much, Hillel. Now, we are, as people will notice, we are beginning to run out of time, getting towards the end. So we may stretch over just a few minutes past 1:45, if that's okay with everybody. I'm going to ask 3 questions now, and I'm going to ask each of you a question that has been put by one of the participants in the conversation. And if you could keep your answer to a couple of minutes each, that would be great. And Allan, I'm going to come to you first. There's a question from Alessandra Rossetti. And the question is this: you mentioned how difficult it would be for the P5 nations to give up their veto, but still wouldn't they need to be part of Plan B? Would any mission or report or recommendations be implemented if it didn't have the buy-in of all 5, and similarly any ICJ ruling? So perhaps Allan, I could turn to you to have a crack at that one.
What I'm suggesting is that the General Assembly might act entirely without the need of getting Security Council concurrence. The Uniting for Peace resolution contemplates a proposition being put before the General Assembly and adopted there. The General Assembly cannot pronounce or adopt legally binding resolutions, but resolutions that it adopts have a moral force, subject to the critique that we just heard from Hillel. They have a moral force that gives a legitimacy to action undertaken pursuant to those resolutions. So if, for example, you're faced next month with another Rwanda or Myanmar, where you see the prospect or the actual occurrence of a mass atrocity, and voices are calling out for intervention to stop it, and all other means have failed, and it's a last resort, and you go to the Security Council where you're blocked by a veto that's anchored in national interest by a member of the P5, I'm suggesting that you go to the General Assembly, and if you get a resolution there authorizing action, that would have a legitimacy that would insulate the action from challenge in international law. That's the view of international law scholars to whom I've referred. I'm putting a paper on the website of Liberal International after this event, which will refer to those articles in greater detail so you can see which I'm referring to. And in short, it provides a way to authorize proceeding entirely without reference to the Security Council. And the last point I want to stress, Myles, is the work of Jennifer Trahan, who's suggesting that we as member states should join together and seek an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on the question whether it's even lawful for a member of the P5 to veto action intended to stop genocide or crimes against humanity. It's a fascinating question that she's raised. She's developed it at length in her excellent book. I commend it to you, and I suggest we pursue that avenue as well.
Thank you very much indeed, Allan. That's great. Now I have a question from Joyce Onstadt, and it's a question for Aicha, Joyce asks, despite the UN failings, would you dismantle it for some unknown new structure and lose the huge humanitarian positives of WHO, WFP, UNCHR, and UNICEF, to name but a few? Aicha, over to you.
That's a very good question. The dismantling the UN is mostly dismantling the UN structure around the Security Council. As I said, it's the raison d'etre of the UN, peace and security. That's the most pressing issue. And this is what the UN, as I said, is not failing because it's not trying to succeed. And nothing would change with the ongoing order. We need a new organization that when it says we the people, we're going to secure the world, it means it and it acts upon it. This organization, of course, needs lots of brainstorming. People have many proposals they're put on table. But one that looks interesting is something that has the ability to make the government and the people decide together. So when we say we the people, the decisions are made by the government in consultation with the people of these countries. But on the humanitarian side, of course, WHO, WFP, UNHCR, UNICEF, although UNICEF is also a development agency, but these agencies have mixed records. They have certainly done well in certain areas. They have responded to disasters, earthquakes, famines, etc. But also the humanitarian work they do is very political and politicized because the funding they receive is mainly for the big powers again. For example, WFP for quite a long time, the World Food Program received almost half of its funding from the US with very strict conditions on who receives the aid, who receives food, what kind of food we receive, which is usually a surplus of food that is subsidized and that harms farmers in developing worlds. When we receive such food, some countries that experience hunger, like Uganda, for example, and Nigeria for quite a long time, they never received food aid because the decision of helping, the humanitarian decision is politicized. So let's not be naive about the humanitarian wing of the UN. It also has huge problems. It has performance issues. It has policy issues. It has recently we've seen many UN agencies that have been accused of sexual misconducts and rape, actually in some countries in Africa and Haiti and other countries. So the humanitarian part of the UN can be fixed, but with different configuration of funding. The moment these organizations count on funding from certain countries with very strict decisions about the political context in which the aid is delivered, then we are definitely not doing service to these countries. I would definitely look at keeping the humanitarian work ongoing, but fixing it in a different configuration and in different conditions.
Thank you very much, Aicha. Hillel, it's your turn, and I've got a question here from Mislav Barashik. I hope I've got that more or less right, from the World Youth Alliance. And his question is about when we talk about electing representatives from countries who violate basic human rights to the Human Rights Commission and other UN bodies. Hang on, I've lost it. To other UN bodies. I think you've got the question there in front of you. Isn't it a more general problem? Over to you.
Okay, yes, I'm on. Myles, you can hear me?
I can hear you. Yes, you're fine.
Good,
So you're there.
Thank you. Yeah. So the question, it may have disappeared, but I saw the question. I was asked about whether there's something inherent about electing certain countries with problematic human rights records, with widespread human rights abuses. Is that inherent to the Commission on Human Rights, which is called today the Human Rights Council? And I don't think it's inherent. I think there is certainly a tension in the criteria that were established is not the norm at the UN. The norm at the UN, although some UN bodies do speak of having some criteria, the General Assembly in theory has criteria for a country to be elected as a member state. It has to be deemed a peace-loving state. But the idea of criteria has basically been abandoned. And the notion of universality, every country that's recognized as a country more or less gets admitted to the UN with some exceptions. And so the idea that the Human Rights Council would actually exclude certain countries because of their poor human rights records is something problematic to the UN system. And clearly we've seen that it hasn't been well respected, but it is possible. We did see in certain cases, a few years ago, Russia failed to win election, which was very embarrassing for Moscow, I can assure you. And I'm fairly certain tomorrow that they've locked up all their vote trades and that it's not going to happen again. The same a number of years ago, Pakistan lost and they won. They've been on for 3 years. I expect they'll win tomorrow again. These are typically done through vote trades. Some of them are publicly announced. Others are secret. We saw some of them leaked on WikiLeaks. But I do think that the criteria system has failed. And we're going to see tomorrow with the election of the regimes that I mentioned, China, Russia, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, that in many cases there's no competition. There's no competition in the Eastern European group. There's no competition in the Western group. There's no competition in the Latin American group with Cuba and so on. So really the elections are a chimera. It's an illusion and they're a failure. Our leading democracies are not doing anything to stop the worst abusers from getting on the council. I believe the time has come to scrap the criteria, to admit that it's a failure. We had a debate back in 2005, Ambassador Rock may recall, on whether the Human Rights Council ought to be universal, like in New York. There's something called the Third Committee on Human Rights, which is every member of the UN General Assembly is automatically, ipso facto, a member of the Third Committee on Human Rights. That includes North Korea, Iran, Myanmar. They're all members of the Third Committee on Human Rights, but no one goes around saying, hi, look at me, I've been elected to the Third Committee, because there's no elections, there's no criteria. So I think, frankly, if the only effect of the criteria is to enable this false badge of international legitimacy, I gave the example of the Saudi ambassador in Canada saying, look at me, we've been elected to the Human Rights Council. If the only effect is to give that regime the badge, but is never being used to exclude the regimes, we're saying now, myself on behalf of UN Watch, scrap the elections, let every country be a member, as it is at the Human Rights Council. Every country is present as an observer, participates, gives speeches. They only just don't vote. I say let every country be a member if we're not using the election criteria at all.
Thank you, Hillel. We are running out of time. I propose that we have another 5 minutes. And what I want to do first is go back to our panelists and give them 1 minute each, because I know you've been looking at all the questions coming in, some fantastic questions, and we just haven't had time, I'm afraid, to get to all of them. So you might just want to pick up one thing or make one final comment before we draw this to a conclusion. So can we do it in the order in which we've done things to date? So Allan, the baton passes to you in the first instance.
Well, thank you very much, Myles. I'll use my minute just to comment, if I may, on the points made by my colleagues on the panel. First, to Aicha, I must say that you make a very powerful case drawing upon your own personal experience, and it's very affecting. But I find it difficult to believe that if we were to scrap the political structures of the United Nations and try to reestablish it today, we'd get very far. The rogue regimes, the authoritarian nationalism that's prevailed in so many regions of the world, with the kind of misrule that we've been talking about throughout this past hour, I doubt very much that you'd get very far. And I think on balance, we're far better to take what we have and try to manage with it than to start from scratch and expect to do better. With respect to Hillel, I tend to agree with your conclusion that if the criteria for membership for the Human Rights Council are to be ignored, then they're better to be dropped. And we're better to have universal membership, let everyone be there or be an observer, and decide each resolution on its merits, and rely upon the courage and conviction of member states to bring forward resolutions when they're appropriate, condemning abuses, condoning good practices, and setting standards of which we can be proud. So I think your point is very well taken. And just finally, in concluding, may I say how very much I've enjoyed listening to my colleagues on the panel, how much I've learned from them. This is Thanksgiving weekend in Canada. One of the things I'm giving thanks for is the opportunity to be on this panel, to be part of this discussion. And I wish you all well. Thanks, Myles.
Thank you, Allan. It's very generous to give up your time on this day. I hope you're going to get a drink after this. You certainly deserve one. Aicha, over to you for your minute.
Okay. Well, thank you for this great opportunity to express an opinion that is not really politically correct when it comes to the UN reform. And usually, especially the liberal community is quite attached to the UN with all its flaws, and I understand that. But I started my career as a UN believer, a true believer. Along the way, I saw lots of flaws, and I still believe that the UN could deliver. But when I saw the red lines, and the red line is genocide, when you have members of the Security Council not only not acting on genocide, but actively participating in it, and that's the case of France in Rwanda, or the Uyghurs and China. I think we've crossed the red line, and then we have to question the whole order. I think we entered a zone that cannot tolerate such level of immoral order. We cannot tolerate that the nations that are supposed to lead this country towards a better world, the nations that are supposed to secure the world, become a source of insecurity, become the people who are selling weapons to murderous regimes, and they're inflicting upon the people of the world suffering, huge suffering. That was unimaginable 50 years ago. This cannot go on. And my point is, yes, we are scared of a world that doesn't have the Security Council around, but as I said, it cannot be worse, at least for the small nations that I represent today. I'm talking to you from Casablanca, the intersection from North Africa and Middle East. And from this part of the world, honestly, it cannot get worse. We've seen the worst of the performance of the UN and the worst face from the UN Security Council. We don't want that anymore. And it would be actually an illusion to think that the rich nations and Western nations are also benefiting from the UN. I don't think so. We have reached this level of decline of democracy. The West is going through a huge crisis of democracy, whether in France, the UK, and the US. And if you look at it, you have definitely to see links to the United Nations and the world that has been led by a Security Council that has a huge deficit of democracy. We need a better world. We need an organization that represents the 21st century, that represents we the people, the nations, the small nations and the big ones. And that when he says security, it really means it. It doesn't mean insecurity and destruction. We definitely need to think of a different structure. Of course, it's something that can be overwhelming to think of a UN without the Security Council, but as I said, it cannot get worse for the countries, the nations that have experienced genocide, death and destructions at the hand of the UN.
Thank you, Aicha. Thanks very much indeed. And indeed, building on that, there have been, one or two questions. One from Tom Doherty about sort of mechanisms for international collaboration at the subnational level, which may be part of the answer. But I regret we don't have time to go into that now. Hillel, over to you for your final minute.
Thank you. I think one of the things that emerged in this conversation is that the United Nations is as strong as its member states. And if there were no United Nations, we'd still have other organizations, the International Red Cross and many other international organizations, which would in many cases would be facing, those that are member state based, would be facing some of the similar issues, the same politics. We heard before now about what countries should do to stop genocide, and there's the moral case. In the end, who's going to send the soldiers? We saw the United States in the past decade doesn't want to send soldiers anymore to Syria or other places. And it's not obvious who's going to do that. And the United Nations is the forum where these things are discussed. It can be the place where action is organized, but it really depends on the member states. I don't think there's a magic bullet. We saw in the United States, and I would say internationally, in the post-Soviet era, in the post-dictatorship era in Latin America, we saw this community of democracies emerged, a group called the Community of Democracies, which had meetings in Warsaw and Seoul and Santiago. And there was a sense that maybe this new body would present a new alternative. But in the end, very few countries are willing to invest in it. And it certainly has not provided any significant alternative to the United Nations. I think, like it or not, with all its virtues and its flaws, the United Nations is there. We have to make it work. And our role as citizens is to demand that our governments do the right thing. I think I agree with Aicha. We have to be fearless in holding UN officials to account and holding our representatives to account. But I think in the end, we have to hold them to account and get our representatives to do the right thing. That will make the United Nations make a difference. We saw it in Venezuela. The Council did nothing for 10 years. We brought victims. We had our resolutions. Finally, this year, a resolution was adopted. Sadly, the Maduro regime is still a member of the Council. We have a campaign. 160,000 people have signed our petition to remove Maduro. We believe it happened to Gaddafi. It could happen to Maduro. Citizens around the world have to unite, and action will happen.
Thank you so much, Hillel. And I'm afraid that we're going to have to draw it to a conclusion there. I want to thank all of our wonderful panelists for their contributions. I've certainly learned a huge amount from this. And I also want to thank those who've been working behind the scenes to make this all happen this evening. It couldn't have happened without a huge amount of preparatory work and people sort of making all the technology work this evening. You will see on your screens, I hope, a couple of websites to go on to. If people have found this an interesting evening and you want to know more about the Liberal International British group, you will see there's a website up there, www.libg.co.uk. And for those of you who may be interested, who are based in the UK and may be interested in learning more about Liberal Democrats and international development, which is kind of linked to this, then please do go and have a look at the website there, which is www.ldid.org. Thank you again so much to everyone. Thank you for everyone for staying on. We've had almost, we've had well over 100 participants in this meeting, and there is still almost that number on here now. Thank you, in spite of the fact we've gone 10 or 15 minutes over time, for sticking with it. I hope you found it as interesting and fascinating as I have. I've learned a huge amount. Thank you again to LIBG for putting it all together. And wherever you are, and there are people all over the world watching this and participating, have a very good morning, afternoon, or evening. And Alan, have that Thanksgiving drink. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Myles. Bye-bye.
Bye.